Ethan Carter had everything: wealth, success, power. But one stormy night, his estranged father, George, arrived at his door seeking refuge. Rejected, George collapses in the cold, sending Ethan spiraling into a reckoning with his past, his mother's sacrifices, and the truth about his father's love. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Ethan Carter stood at the window of his mansion, watching the rain pour down over his perfectly manicured lawn. At 45, he had everything money could buy: the biggest house in Highland Hills, a fleet of luxury cars, and his company's name plastered across half the buildings downtown. But tonight, something felt off. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the whiskey in his hand, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The doorbell rang, cutting through the silence of his empty house. Sarah, his housekeeper, had already gone home for the day. Ethan walked to the door, annoyed at the interruption. When he opened it, his heart nearly stopped. There stood George Carter, his father, looking smaller and older than Ethan remembered. His grey hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain, and his worn jacket was soaked through. The old man clutched a small duffel bag like it was all he had left in the world. Maybe it was. "What are you doing here?" Ethan's voice came out cold and hard. He hadn't spoken to his father in 5 years, not since his mother's funeral. George cleared his throat. "Son, I lost the house. The bank took it. I didn't know where else to go." Ethan felt the familiar anger rising in his chest. All his life he'd watched his father fail. Failed businesses, failed investments, failed dreams. Every time George had come crawling back to someone else for help. "So you thought you'd come to me?" Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The son you barely raised, the one who had to fight for everything he has?" "Ethan, please. Just for a few days until I can figure something out." George's voice shook. Whether from cold or emotion, Ethan didn't care. "Figure something out? Like you figured out how to blow Mom's life insurance money on another one of your stupid business ideas." The words came pouring out, bitter and sharp. "Or like how you figured out how to miss my college graduation because you were too busy. Chasing another dead-end dream?" Lightning flashed, illuminating the tears in George's eyes. "Son, I know I made mistakes, but I'm your father." "No!" Ethan's shout echoed through the marble foyer. A father is someone who's there for his kids, someone who puts food on the table, someone who doesn't make his wife work 2 jobs while he chases pipe dreams. George took a step back, stumbling slightly. "You don't understand. Everything I did." "Get out!" Ethan's voice was ice cold now. "Get out of my house, you old bastard!" "Ethan, please!" But Ethan had already grabbed his father's arm, pushing him back into the rain. The old man's duffel bag fell, spilling its meager contents onto the wet driveway. George tried to gather his things, his hands shaking. "Don't ever come back here," Ethan said, standing in the doorway. "I made myself successful despite you, not because of you." With that, he slammed the door. Through the thick wooden door, he could hear his father's quiet sobs mixing with the sound of the rain. Ethan poured himself another drink, trying to drown out the sound. After a few minutes, he heard shuffling footsteps moving away from the house. Back in his study, Ethan tried to focus on work. His company, Carter Technologies, was in the middle of a major acquisition. He had meetings tomorrow that could make him even richer. That's what mattered, right? Success, money, power, all the things his father never had. But as the storm raged, outside, Ethan couldn't shake the image of his father's defeated face. He told himself it was just another one of George's acts. The man had always been good at playing the victim. Still, something nagged at him. His phone rang, making him jump. It was his sister, Lily. He almost didn't answer. She always took their father's side, but something made him pick up. "What do you want, Lily?" His sister's voice was thick with tears. "How could you, Ethan? How could you throw Dad out like that?" "He told you already?" That was fast. Ethan swirled the whiskey in his glass. "Let me guess, he's at your place, now telling you all about how cruel I am." "He's not at my place, Ethan," Lily's voice cracked. "He's in the hospital. They found him collapsed on Burton Street, half a mile from your house. He's in the emergency room right now." The whiskey glass slipped from Ethan's hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. "What?" "He's 70 years old, Ethan. It's 40 degrees out there, and it's pouring rain. What were you thinking?" Ethan's mouth went dry. I didn't. Save it, Lily cut him off. I'm at St. Mary's Hospital. If you have any humanity left in you, you'll come down here and face what you've done. The line went dead. Ethan stared at his phone, then at the broken glass on the floor. The whiskey had left a stain on the expensive wood. Somehow that seemed important. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Ethan's mind, a different kind of storm was brewing. For the first time in years, he felt something crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. And through that crack, something dangerous was seeping in. Doubt. His father's words echoed in his head. Everything I did. What had he been trying to say? For the first time, Ethan wondered if there was more to the story than he'd allowed himself to believe. But now, sitting alone in his big empty house, he faced the possibility that he might have made a terrible mistake. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with activity, but Ethan barely noticed. He sat in the waiting room, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie loose around his neck. Down the hall, doctors were treating his father for hypothermia and exhaustion. The guilt sat in his stomach like a lead weight. Lily paced back and forth, her arms crossed. She hadn't said a word to him since he arrived. Finally, she stopped and turned to face him. "You know what the worst part is?" she said, her voice tight with anger. "Dad was coming to you because he trusted you. Even after all these years of you treating him like dirt, he still believed in you." Ethan ran his hands through his hair. "Lily, you don't understand. You were too young to remember how it was. All the times he let us down. No, you don't understand." Lily's voice rose, making other people in the waiting room turn to look. "You've been so busy hating Dad that you never bothered to learn the truth." "What truth?" Ethan scoffed. "That he was a failure. That he couldn't hold down a job. That Mom had to work herself to death to support us." Lily dug into her purse and pulled out an envelope. It was old and worn at the edges. "Here," she said, throwing it in his lap. "Read it. It's a letter Mom wrote before she died. She made me promise not to show you unless I absolutely had to. Well, guess what? Now I have to." Ethan stared at the envelope. His mother's neat handwriting spelled out his name on the front. With shaking hands, he opened it and began to read. "My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you still haven't forgiven your father. I hoped it wouldn't come to this, but I know how stubborn you can be, just like him. There's something you need to know about your father, something we decided to keep from you and Lily when you were young. All those failed businesses you resent him for, they weren't failures at all. Your father sold them one by one to pay for your education. Remember that fancy private school you went to? The one that gave you the connections to start your company? Your father sold his beloved auto repair shop to pay for it. He gave up his dream so you could have a better chance at yours. All those times he wasn't there. He was working 3 jobs using fake names so you wouldn't find out. He didn't want you to know we were struggling. He wanted you to focus on your studies, to reach for the stars without worrying about us. The reason he missed your graduation wasn't because of some business venture. He was in the hospital. He'd been working 20-hour days and his heart couldn't take it. But he made me promise not to tell you. He didn't want to ruin your big day with his problems. Your father isn't perfect, Ethan, but everything he did, every sacrifice he made was for you and Lily. He wanted you to have the opportunities he never had. I'm writing this from my hospital bed. The cancer is getting worse, and I know I don't have much time left. Promise me you'll try to understand him. Ethan, promise me you'll look past your anger and see the truth. All my love, Mom." The letter fell from Ethan's trembling hands. Memories flooded back, but now they were different. The times his father came home late, smelling like grease and sweat. The mysterious deposits in his college fund. The proud smile on his father's tired face at his graduation, even though he'd shown up late. He sold his businesses for me." Ethan's voice cracked. Lily sat down beside him. "The auto shop was just the start. When you got into Harvard Business School, he sold everything else. The house, his tools, even Mom's jewelry, with her blessing, of course. They both believed in you that much. But why didn't he tell me?" "Would you have accepted it?" Lily asked softly. "You were so determined to prove you could make it on your own. Dad knew that. He said your pride was both your greatest strength and your greatest weakness. A doctor appeared in the waiting room. Carter family. Ethan and Lily stood up. The doctor's face was serious. Your father is stable, but the exposure took a toll on his system. We'd like to keep him for observation. His heart isn't as strong as it should be. There's evidence of long-term stress damage. Long-term stress damage, Ethan repeated numbly. Yes. From the look of his medical history, he's been overworking himself for decades. His body is worn out. After the doctor left, Ethan slumped back in his chair. All these years he'd been living in his mansion, enjoying his wealth, while his father worked himself to death. And tonight, he'd thrown him out in the rain. Can I see him? Ethan asked. Lily shook her head. He's sedated right now, and honestly, I'm not sure he'll want to see you when he wakes up. I need to make this right, Lily, please. You can start by looking through this, Lily said, pulling a small box from her bag. I found it in Dad's duffel bag. It's everything he kept about you. Inside the box, Ethan found newspaper clippings about his business success, photos of him at charity events, even the Father's Day cards he'd sent grudgingly over the years. At the bottom was a wrinkled photograph of a much younger George Carter standing proudly in front of his auto repair shop. Written on the back in his father's shaky handwriting were the words, "Worth every penny to see my son succeed." Ethan covered his face with his hands, but he couldn't hide from the truth anymore. He'd built his empire on a foundation of sacrifice, his father's sacrifice. And how had he repaid that sacrifice? With scorn and cruelty. Outside the hospital windows, the storm had passed, but the real tempest was just beginning in Ethan's heart. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, he made a silent promise to his unconscious father. This time, he would be the one to make things right. Morning light streamed through the hospital windows as Ethan sat beside his father's bed. George Carter lay still, his face pale against the white pillows, tubes and wires connecting him to beeping machines. He looked small and fragile in the hospital gown, nothing like the strong man Ethan remembered from his childhood. A nurse came in to check George's vital signs. "Are you family?" she asked, giving Ethan a suspicious look. His expensive suit was wrinkled from spending the night in the waiting room. "I'm his son," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. The nurse's expression softened. "He was asking for you earlier, when they brought him in. Even when he was delirious from the cold, he kept saying he needed to explain something to his son." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Even after being thrown out in the rain, his father's thoughts had been of him. He reached out and took his father's hand. It felt cold and lifeless. "I'm here now, Dad," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Lily appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Ethan without a word. "I called Rebecca," she said, referring to Ethan's wife. "She's on her way with the kids." Ethan nodded. He hadn't even thought about calling his own family. Rebecca had been telling him for years that he was too hard on his father, but he'd never listened. Now he wondered what else he'd been wrong. About Mr. Carter. A doctor entered the room holding a clipboard. "I'm Dr. Phillips. I've been reviewing your father's medical history. Are you aware that he had a heart attack 5 years ago?" Ethan's head snapped up. "What? No, I had no idea. It was right around the time your mother passed," Lily explained quietly. "He made me promise not to tell you. Said you had enough on your plate with the company merger." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. 5 years ago, Ethan had closed the biggest deal of his career, becoming one of the youngest billionaires in the country. While he'd been celebrating his success, his father had been fighting for his life, alone. The physical stress from last night's exposure has put additional strain on his heart, Dr. Phillips continued. "We're monitoring him closely, but he's going to need significant care during his recovery." "Does he have somewhere to stay? Someone to look after him?" "He's staying with me," Ethan said firmly, ignoring Lily's surprised look. "I have plenty of room and I can hire the best home care nurses." "Money isn't everything, Ethan," Lily said after the doctor left. "Dad needs more than just fancy nurses and a comfortable bed. He needs family, real family." "I know." Ethan stood up and walked to the window. Below, the hospital parking lot was filling up with morning visitors. "I've been so blind, Lily. All these years, I thought I was better than him because I had more. money, more success, but he's the one who gave up everything for his family. What have I ever sacrificed? A small sound from the bed made them both turn. George's eyes were fluttering open. "Dad?" Lily rushed to his side. George's eyes focused slowly. When they landed on Ethan, they filled with a mixture of fear and sadness that made Ethan's heart ache. "I'm sorry," George whispered, his voice barely audible. "I tried to be a good father. No, Dad, I'm the one who's sorry." Ethan moved closer to the bed. "I just read Mom's letter. I know everything now. About the businesses, the jobs, the sacrifices. You weren't supposed to know." George tried to sit up but fell back weakly. "I wanted you to believe in yourself, to think you did it all on your own. But why? Why let me think such horrible things about you?" A ghost of a smile crossed George's tired face. "Because that's what parents do. We put our children first, your success and your happiness. That's all that mattered." Tears rolled down Ethan's cheeks, the first time he'd cried since his mother's funeral. "I treated you so badly. All these years..." "Shh!" George reached out a shaking hand to touch his son's arm. "The past is past." Just then, the door burst open and two small figures rushed in. "Grandpa!" Ethan's children, Emma and Jack, ran to the bed, followed by Rebecca. "Careful with Grandpa," Rebecca warned. "He's not feeling well." George's face lit up at the sight of his grandchildren. "There's my favorite troublemakers." "Daddy said you're coming to live with us," Emma announced. "Is it true? Can we have breakfast together every day?" George looked questioningly at Ethan. "If you'll let me make things right," Ethan said softly. "Please, Dad, come home with us." For a long moment, George was quiet. The machines beeped steadily in the background. Finally, he spoke. "On one condition," he said. "Anything. No more working yourself to death." George's eyes were serious. "I didn't sacrifice everything just to watch you make the same mistakes. I did. Family comes first. Promise me." Ethan looked around the room, at his sister who had kept their father's secrets for so long, at his wife who had tried to show him the truth, at his children who loved their grandfather unconditionally, and at his father who had given up everything for him. "I promise," he said, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally doing something right. Outside the window, the sun had fully risen, casting a warm glow over the city. In room 302 of St. Mary's Hospital, a family broken by pride and misunderstanding was taking its first steps toward healing. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Old habits die hard, and some wounds take more than just words to heal. A week later, George Carter walked slowly through the front door of Ethan's mansion, leaning on a walker. The marble foyer looked different now, colder somehow, as he remembered being thrown out into the rain that terrible night. "We've set up your room on the first floor, Dad," Ethan said quickly, noticing his father's discomfort. "You won't have to deal with any stairs." Maria, the new live-in nurse Ethan had hired, followed behind with George's medical equipment. She was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who had 20 years of experience caring for cardiac patients. "Mr. Carter, would you like to rest before dinner?" she asked. "Please, call me George," he replied with a tired smile. "And yes, I think I need to lie down for a bit." As Maria helped George to his room, Rebecca appeared in the hallway. "Ethan, we need to talk." She led him to his home office and closed the door. Marcus Reynolds called again. "He's threatening to take the story to the press." Ethan's jaw tightened. Marcus Reynolds was a board member at Carter Technologies, and he'd been causing trouble ever since Ethan had started missing important meetings to be at the hospital with his father. "Let him," Ethan said. "I don't care what the papers say about me." "It's not just about you anymore," Rebecca insisted. "He's been digging into your father's past. He found out about the businesses your father sold, but he's twisting the story. He's saying there were illegal dealings, tax evasion. That's ridiculous." Ethan slammed his hand on the desk. "Everything Dad did was legal. He sacrificed everything. For me. I know that. But Reynolds is powerful. He's trying to force you out of the company, Ethan. He's saying you're distracted, that your family drama is affecting your judgment." Before Ethan could respond, they heard a crash from down the hall, followed by Emma's frightened cry. "Grandpa!" They rushed out to find George on the floor of his room, the walker toppled beside him. Emma stood in the doorway, tears in her eyes. Maria was already helping him up. I'm fine, George insisted, but his face was pale and sweaty. Just lost my balance for a moment. Dad, you need to be more careful, Ethan said, his voice sharp with worry. Emma, honey, you shouldn't be in here bothering Grandpa. Why she wasn't bothering me, George defended his granddaughter. She was showing me her drawings. Emma ran to her grandfather, wrapping her arms around him once Maria had helped him to a chair. I made them for you, Grandpa, to make your room prettier. George hugged her back, but Ethan noticed him wince slightly at the pressure on his chest. Emma, go find your brother, Rebecca said gently. It's almost dinner time. After Emma left, Maria took George's vital signs. Your heart rate is elevated, Mr. Carter, George. You need to rest. See what happens when you try to do too much? Ethan couldn't keep the frustration from his voice. You have to be more careful. Don't talk to me like I'm a child, Ethan, George said quietly. I may be sick, but I'm still your father. The words hung in the air between them. Rebecca touched Ethan's arm. Let's let your father rest. In the hallway, Ethan ran his hands through his hair. I don't know how to do this, Rebecca. Every time I see him stumble or struggle to breathe, I remember that night. I remember what I did. You can't change the past, Rebecca said, but you can be there for him now. Just try not to control everything. He needs his dignity as much as he needs care. Later that evening, Ethan sat in his office trying to focus on work. The company's stock had dropped 5 points since rumors of his family troubles had started circulating. Marcus Reynolds was gathering support among the board members. 20 years of building his company, and it could all fall apart because he finally decided to do the right thing by his father. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Jack, his 10-year-old son. Dad, Grandpa's asking for you. Ethan found his father sitting up in bed looking at old photographs spread across his lap. Come here, son. George patted the edge of the bed. I want to show you something. The photos were from Ethan's childhood. Birthdays, school events, family, picnics. In every one, George was there in the background looking younger and stronger. You were always there, Ethan said softly. I just never saw it. I made mistakes, George admitted. Maybe I should have told you the truth about the businesses, about the extra jobs, but I was so proud, watching you build your dream. I didn't want you to feel guilty or obligated. And now I might lose it all, Ethan said before he could stop himself. He told his father about Marcus Reynolds and the board's threats. George listened quietly, then asked, Do you know why my auto repair shop was successful before I sold it? No, you never talked about it. Because I treated every customer like family. Rich or poor, they knew they could trust me. The money was secondary. It was about doing right by people. George picked up a photo of his old shop. Sometimes we have to lose something valuable to gain something priceless. Ethan stared at his father. Even now, weak and sick, George was still trying to teach him. I'll fight Reynolds, Ethan said. But not for the company, for the truth about you. I won't let him drag your name through the mud. George squeezed his son's hand. Just remember what's really important. All the money in the world won't mean anything if you lose your family in the process. That night, Ethan lay awake in bed, his father's words echoing in his mind. The company he'd built might be in danger, but for the first time in his life, he was starting to understand what real success looked like. It wasn't in the numbers on a stock ticker or the size of his mansion. It was in the sound of his father's laughter as he told stories to the grandchildren. It was in the way Emma's drawings now covered the walls of George's room. It was in the quiet moments of healing between a father and son who had lost too many years to pride and misunderstanding. But as he drifted off to sleep, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus Reynolds wasn't going to give up easily. The real test of his newfound priorities was still to come. The morning headline in the Business Daily screamed, Carter Technologies CEO under fire. Board questions, leadership amid family crisis. Ethan threw the newspaper across his office, where it landed next to a stack of similar articles from the past week. They're calling for an emergency board meeting tomorrow, Patricia, his executive assistant, said nervously. Marcus Reynolds has submitted a motion for your temporary removal as CEO. Ethan loosened his tie. The pressure was building from all sides. The company's stock had dropped another 10 points overnight. Investors were getting nervous. And now, this? His phone buzzed. It was Maria, his father's nurse. His heart jumped. "Is everything okay?" he answered quickly. "Your father's fine, Mr. Carter," Maria assured him. "But he's asking to come to the office. He says he needs to talk to you about something important." "The office? He's not strong enough for that. I tried to tell him that, but he's quite insistent. He says it can't wait." Ethan glanced at his schedule. Back-to-back meetings all day with nervous investors. "Tell him I'll come home as soon as I can." But before he could hang up, he heard his father's voice in the background. "Tell him I'm coming whether he likes it or not." An hour later, George Carter walked slowly into Ethan's office, leaning on his walker. Maria hovered anxiously behind him. Despite Ethan's protests, his father had insisted on dressing in his old suit, the one he used to wear to church on Sundays. "Dad, you shouldn't be here," Ethan said, rushing to help him to a chair. My heart has been through worse," George cut him off. "We need to talk about Marcus Reynolds." Ethan frowned. "You don't need to worry about that. I can handle." "Reynolds? Like you handled things with me?" George's words were gentle but firm. "Son, you're making the same mistake again. You're letting pride blind you to the truth." "What truth? Reynolds is trying to steal my company." "No." George pulled an old, worn envelope from his jacket pocket. "He's trying to protect it. From me." Ethan stared at the envelope. "What are you talking about?" 25 years ago, when I sold my auto repair shop to pay for your schooling, Marcus Reynolds was my lawyer. He helped me structure the sale, make it legal and above board. But he also saw what that sale did to me. How? It broke my heart to give up my dream for yours." George's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a yellowed contract. "Reynolds made me promise that if you ever became successful, I wouldn't come asking for money or try to take advantage. He made me sign this contract, giving up any future claims to your wealth." Ethan felt like he'd been punched in the gut. "He made you sign away your rights to your own son's success." "He was protecting you," George said, "and he was right to do it. Look at what's happening now. The company's suffering because you're distracted by me." "That's not true, isn't it?" George leaned forward. "You've missed meetings, ignored calls, spent days at the hospital. The key business you built is starting to crumble, and it's because of me." "I don't care about the business," Ethan exploded. "I care about you, about making things right." "But that's not what I want." George's voice rose, then he clutched his chest, breathing heavily. Maria rushed forward with his medication, but George waved her away. "I'm fine, just give us a minute." After Maria reluctantly stepped out, George continued more quietly. "Son, I didn't give up everything just to watch you throw it all away. Your success wasn't just your dream, it was mine too. Every sacrifice I made was an investment in you." Tears filled Ethan's eyes. "So what am I supposed to do? Let Reynolds drag your name through the mud? Let him paint you as some kind of con man trying to exploit your son's wealth?" "Let me talk to him," George said. "He'll listen to me." "Absolutely." You're not strong enough." "I'm strong enough to fix my own mistakes." George struggled to his feet. "I won't let you destroy everything you've built because of me. Not again." Suddenly, George's face went pale. He reached for his walker, but missed, stumbling forward. Ethan caught him just before he hit the ground. "Dad? Dad!" Ethan lowered his father to the floor as Maria rushed back in. George's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. "Call an ambulance!" Ethan shouted to Patricia, who was already dialing. He held his father's hand, feeling the weak pulse. "Please, Dad, not like this. I need you. The kids need you." In the ambulance, George drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time his eyes opened, he tried to speak, but the oxygen mask made it impossible. Ethan held his hand the whole way, remembering all the times his father had held his hand when he was sick as a child. At the hospital, Dr. Phillips met them in the emergency room. His face was grave as he examined George. "The stress was too much," he said. "His heart is severely weakened. We need to operate immediately." "Operate?" Ethan felt the world spinning. "But you said his heart couldn't handle surgery." "If we don't operate, he won't make it through the night." As they wheeled George toward the operating room, his eyes fluttered open. He pulled off the oxygen mask just long enough to whisper, "The letter see in my jacket for Reynolds." Then he was gone, disappearing behind the swinging doors, leaving Ethan alone in the hallway with his father's jacket clutched in his trembling hands. In the pocket, he found another envelope, sealed and addressed to Marcus Reynolds. On the front, in his father's shaky handwriting, were the words, "The truth about my son." Ethan stared at the envelope as a war raged inside him. His father's life hung in the balance, his company was slipping away, and now this mysterious letter held secrets he wasn't sure he was ready to face. In the waiting room, his phone buzzed constantly with messages about tomorrow's board meeting. But for once in his life, Ethan Carter, the man who always had to be in control, sat helplessly as life's biggest decisions were made without him. The surgery waiting room at St. Mary's Hospital felt smaller than Ethan remembered. Rebecca sat beside him, holding his hand while Lily paced nervously. The envelope addressed to Marcus Reynolds sat unopened on the table in front of them, seeming to mock them with its secrets. "You should read it," Lily said finally. "Whatever Dad wrote to Reynolds, you need to know before the board meeting tomorrow." Ethan picked up the envelope, then put it down again. What if there's something in here I don't want to know? "Since when does Ethan Carter run from the truth?" Rebecca asked gently. Before he could answer, his phone rang. It was Patricia from the office. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry to bother you, but Marcus Reynolds is here. He's demanding to see you before tomorrow's meeting." Ethan's first instinct was to tell Reynolds to go to hell, but then he remembered his father's last conscious words, his insistence that Reynolds needed to hear the truth. "Tell him." Ethan looked at the envelope, then at the operating room doors where somewhere behind them his father was fighting for his life. "Tell him to come to St. Mary's Hospital. If he wants to talk, he can do it here." 30 minutes later, Marcus Reynolds walked into the waiting room. He was older than Ethan remembered, his hair more grey than black now, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He looked out of place, in his expensive suit among the worried families waiting for news of their loved ones. "I heard about your father," Reynolds said, his voice softer than Ethan expected. "How is he?" "Fighting for his life because of you." Lily stepped forward, but Rebecca held her back. "No," Ethan said, standing up. "Because of me. Because I didn't listen when he tried to tell me the truth." He picked up the envelope. "He wanted you to have this." Reynolds took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. As he read, his face went through a range of emotions, surprise, sadness, and finally something that looked like respect. "Your father." Reynolds sat down heavily. "He was always a better man than any of us deserved." "What does it say?" Lily demanded. Reynolds handed the letter to Ethan. "Read it yourself." Ethan unfolded the paper and began to read aloud. "Dear Marcus, if you're reading this, I've probably done something foolish like try to fix things myself. Old habits die hard, I suppose. You were right all those years ago when you made me sign that contract. You saw what I couldn't, that a father's love can sometimes do more harm than good. You were protecting Ethan from me, and I thank you for that. But now I need you to protect him again, this time from himself. Ethan thinks he needs to choose between his company and his family. He doesn't realize that every sacrifice I made was so he would never have to make that choice. I sold my businesses not just to pay for his education, but to teach him the value of what he would build. The contract you made me sign, I want you to tear it up. Not because I want anything from my son's success, but because he needs to know that everything I did was my choice, my gift to him. Tell the board that I'm not a threat to Carter Technologies. Tell them that every penny I gave up to help build Ethan's dream was the best investment I ever made. And tell my son that it's okay to be both a good businessman and a good son. God knows I tried to be both a good businessman and a good father, and failed at both until I learned that love matters more than pride. Take care of him, Marcus, and remind him that sometimes the biggest successes in life have nothing to do with money. Your old friend, George Carter." Ethan's voice broke as he finished reading. The waiting room was silent except for the quiet sobs of his sister. "Your father came to my office last week." Reynolds said quietly. He knew what was happening with the board. He begged me to help find a solution that wouldn't hurt you or the company. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have listened? You were so focused on protecting him that you couldn't see he was trying to protect you. Just then, Dr. Phillips appeared in the doorway. Everyone stood up. The surgery was more complicated than we expected, the doctor said. There was significant damage to his heart, but we managed to stabilize him. The next 24 hours will be critical. Can we see him? Lily asked. He's in recovery now. Once we move him to ICU, you can visit briefly, one at a time. After the doctor left, Reynolds turned to Ethan. The board meeting. I don't care about the meeting, Ethan started to say, but Reynolds held up his hand. Your father cares. He risked his life coming to my office to make sure you wouldn't lose everything you've built. Don't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Rebecca squeezed Ethan's hand. I'll stay here with your father. You go to the meeting. It's what he would want. Ethan looked at the letter in his hands, then at the ICU doors where his father lay fighting for his life once again because of him. The meeting's not until morning, he said finally. Tonight I need to be here with my father. Reynolds nodded. I'll tell the board we need to postpone. Family comes first. That's what your father taught me all those years ago. As Reynolds turned to leave, Ethan called after him. Thank you for looking out for him, for looking out for all of us. Don't thank me, Reynolds said. Just prove to your father that all his sacrifices were worth it. Be the man he always knew you could be. That night, Ethan sat by his father's bed in the ICU, holding his hand just as he had in the ambulance. The machines beeped steadily, monitoring every precious heartbeat. I understand now, Dad, he whispered. About sacrifice, about love, about what really matters. Please stay with us. Long enough for me to show you. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled like stars, while inside room 507, a son kept vigil, praying for one more chance to make things right. Dawn broke over the city as Ethan left his father's hospital room. He hadn't slept, but somehow he felt more clear-headed than ever before. George had made it through the night, his condition stable but still critical. Now it was time for Ethan to face the board. Are you sure about this? Rebecca asked, handing him a fresh shirt she'd brought from home. The board members might not understand. They don't need to understand, Ethan said, changing in the hospital bathroom. They just need to listen. When he arrived at Carter Technologies headquarters, the lobby was already filled with reporters. Camera flashes went off as he walked through the doors, Patricia rushing to meet him. They're all waiting in the main conference room, she said, hurrying to keep up with his stride. Every board member is here. Ethan paused outside the conference room doors. Through the glass, he could see Marcus Reynolds sitting at the head of the table, speaking quietly with the other board members. This room where he'd made so many important decisions suddenly felt different. He straightened his tie and walked in. The room fell silent. Before we begin, Ethan said, his voice strong and clear, I want to tell you a story about my father. Mr. Carter, one of the board members interrupted. We're here to discuss the company's future, not your family matters. They're the same thing, Ethan replied. You see, 25 years ago, a man owned a successful auto repair shop. He'd built, started from nothing, working 16-hour days, sacrificing everything for his dream. That shop was his life. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each board member. But one day his son got accepted into an expensive private school, a school that could give him opportunities the father never had. Without hesitation, this man sold his beloved shop. He gave up everything he'd built so his son could have a better future. We're aware of your father's financial decisions, another board member said uncomfortably. No, you're not. Ethan's voice sharpened. You've seen the paperwork, the contracts, the sales records. But you haven't seen the man who worked 3 jobs after selling his business, just to make sure his son never felt poor. You haven't seen the father who missed his son's graduation because he was in the hospital from exhaustion, but made his wife promise not to tell because he didn't want to ruin his son's big day. He pulled out his father's letter to Reynolds and laid it on the table. My father taught me everything I know about business, but not in the way you might think. He taught me that true success isn't about how much money you make. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice for what matters most. Marcus Reynolds stood up. Ethan is right. I've known George Carter for 25 years. Everything he did, every sacrifice he made, was to ensure his son's success. The very success that built this company. That's very touching, Janet Morrison, one of the most skeptical board members, said. But it doesn't change the fact that you've been distracted, missing meetings, neglecting your duties. You're right, Ethan nodded. I have been distracted. Because for the first time in my life, I'm trying to be not just a good CEO, but a good son. And if this board can't understand that, then maybe I shouldn't be CEO at all. A murmur ran through the room. Reynolds smiled slightly. Are you threatening to resign? Morrison asked, shocked. No, I'm telling you that I've learned what real leadership means. It means making hard choices. It means putting people before profit sometimes. It means understanding that the strength of any company comes from the values it stands for. He pulled out a folder and passed it around the table. This is my new proposal for the company's future. You'll see I've included expanded family leave, policies, better healthcare coverage, and a new program to help employees care for sick relatives. Because I've learned firsthand how impossible it is to do good work when you're worried about your family. This will cost millions, someone protested. It will save millions, Ethan countered, in reduced turnover, increased loyalty, and improved productivity. But more importantly, it will show the world what Carter Technologies truly stands for, the values my father taught me through his own example. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Rebecca. His heart stopped for a moment until he read it. Dad's awake. He's asking, "For you?" "Now," Ethan said. "You can vote however you want. Remove me as CEO if you think that's best for the company. But know this, everything I am, everything this company is, was built on the foundation of a father's love and sacrifice. I won't dishonor that legacy by putting profits before people ever again." He turned to leave, but Morrison's voice stopped him. "Where are you going? We haven't voted yet." "To the hospital. My father is awake and he needs me. The vote can wait." As he reached the door, Reynolds stood up. "I move to cancel the vote for removal. All in favor?" One by one, hands went up around the table. Even Morrison raised hers, albeit slowly. "Go," Reynolds said. "Tell your father his investment paid off. His son became exactly the man he always believed he could be." Ethan rushed back to the hospital, his heart pounding. When he entered his father's room, George was propped up slightly, looking pale but alert. Emma and Jack were already there, showing him new drawings. "There's my boy," George said weakly. Ethan took his father's hand. "The board meeting doesn't matter," George whispered. "No, it does matter. Because I finally understood what you've been trying to teach me all along. Success isn't what you gain, it's what you give. And you gave me everything." Tears rolled down George's cheeks. "I gave you nothing you didn't earn." "You gave me love," Ethan's voice cracked. "Unconditional, unending love. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it." Outside, the window. The morning sun painted the sky in shades of hope, while inside the hospital room a father and son held onto each other, their hearts finally beating in sync. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but now they would face them together, guided by the greatest business lesson of all, that love, not money, is the truest measure of success. 2 weeks after his surgery, George Carter sat in the garden of Ethan's mansion, wrapped in a warm blanket despite the mild spring weather. Emma sat at his feet reading him a story from her school book, while Jack practiced his soccer moves nearby. "Grandpa, look!" Jack called out, attempting a trick with the ball. "Coach says I might make the starting team," George smiled proudly. "Just like your father at your age. He was the fastest player on his team." Emma looked up from her book. "Daddy played soccer." "Oh yes," George chuckled. "But he quit when he was 12, said he needed to focus on more important things." "Like what?" Jack asked, coming closer. George's smile faded slightly, like growing up too fast. Inside the house, Ethan watched the scene through the window of his home office. The sight of his father with the children still made his heart ache with regret for all the years they'd lost. "You can't change the past," Rebecca said, coming up behind him. "But you're changing the future." "I just hope we have enough time," Ethan replied softly. "The doctors say his heart is still very weak." Rebecca squeezed his shoulder. then make every moment count. The doorbell rang, and Maria, who was arranging George's medications in the kitchen, went to answer it. A moment later, she appeared in Ethan's office looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Carter, there's a woman here. She says she's your mother's sister, Catherine Mitchell." Ethan's face darkened. "Aunt Catherine? I haven't seen her since Mom's funeral. Should I ask her to leave?" Before Ethan could answer, a sharp voice rang out from the hallway. "Is that any way to treat family, Ethan?" Catherine Mitchell swept into the office, elegant and imposing as ever in her designer suit. Her eyes swept the room critically. "Well, I see success hasn't improved your taste in art," she said, eyeing the children's drawings Ethan had framed on his wall. "Though I suppose that's your father's influence. What do you want, Aunt Catherine?" Ethan's voice was cold. "Can't an aunt check on her sick brother-in-law?" She moved to the window, watching George and the children. "Though I must say, he seems to have landed on his feet quite nicely, living in luxury after all those years of, what did he call it, sacrificing everything." "Don't." Ethan's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare mock his sacrifices." "Sacrifices?" Catherine turned to face him. "Is that what he told you? That he sacrificed everything for you? Did he tell you about the money he borrowed from your mother's family? The money he promised to repay but never did?" Ethan felt like he'd been slapped. "What are you talking about? Ask him about the $50,000 he borrowed from your grandfather just before he sold that precious auto shop of his. The money that was supposed to be for your mother's treatment when she got sick." "That's not true," Ethan said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Dad sold the shop to pay for my education." "Oh, he sold it all right. But not just for your education." Catherine pulled an old document from her purse. "Your mother never wanted you to know. She made us promise. But now that he's wormed his way back into your life, taking advantage of your guilt, get out." Ethan's voice shook with anger. "Get out of my house." "Fine, but read this first." She placed the document on his desk. "It's the loan agreement your father signed. Ask him about it. Ask him what really happened to that money." After she left, Ethan stared at the document, his hands trembling. Rebecca picked it up and read it. "Ethan," she said gently, "maybe there's an explanation." "An explanation?" "For lying. To me again. For keeping secrets about Mom." Through the window, they could hear Emma's laughter as George told her a story. The sound, which had brought Ethan so much joy just moments ago, now felt like a knife in his heart. "You need to talk to him," Rebecca urged. "Don't let this poison everything you've rebuilt." Ethan nodded slowly. "You're right, but not today. He's still too weak." That night, after the children were in bed, Ethan sat alone in his study, reading and rereading the loan document. The signature was definitely his father's. The date matched the time just before he sold the auto shop. But something didn't add up. He pulled out his laptop and started searching through old records. His mother's medical bills, his school tuition, payments, the sale documents for the auto shop. There had to be a pattern or explanation. As midnight approached, Rebecca found him surrounded by papers, his eyes red from strain. "Come to bed," she pleaded. "You can't solve this tonight." "I have to know the truth," Ethan insisted. "All of it." Just then, they heard a crash from George's room, followed by Maria's startled cry. They rushed down the hall to find George on the floor, clutching his chest, while Maria tried to help him up. "I'm fine," George gasped. "Just got dizzy." But Ethan could see the pain in his father's face, the way his left arm trembled. "Call an ambulance," he told Rebecca. Then, kneeling beside his father, he took his hand. "Hold on, Dad. Just hold on." As they waited for the ambulance, the loan document burned in Ethan's mind. So many questions, so many secrets still between them. His father's face was gray with pain, his breathing labored. "I need to tell you something," George whispered. "About your mother, about the money." "Shh," Ethan said. "Save your strength, we'll talk later." But as the paramedics rushed in with their equipment, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The truth about the past was threatening to destroy their fragile present, and his father's weakened heart might not survive the strain of either. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital was becoming all too familiar. As doctors worked to stabilize George, Ethan paced the waiting room, the weight of Aunt Catherine's revelations heavy on his heart. "Mr. Carter?" A nurse approached with a small box. "We found this in your father's robe pocket. He was quite insistent that you should have it." Ethan took the box, his hands shaking. Inside, he found an old leather wallet, worn and cracked with age. Between the folds of leather was a stack of yellowed papers and an envelope addressed to him in his mother's handwriting. "Another letter?" Rebecca whispered, sitting beside him. Ethan opened the envelope slowly, recognizing his mother's neat script. "My darling son, if you're reading this, then Catherine has probably told you about the loan. I made her promise not to say anything until after I was gone, but I know my sister. She never could let anything go. Yes, your father borrowed money from my family, but not for what Catherine thinks. The truth is, I was the one who asked him to do it. Remember when I got sick the first time? The doctors said I needed expensive treatments. Your father wanted to sell the auto shop right then to pay for them, but I couldn't let him. That shop was his dream. And more importantly, it was our safety net for your future. So I convinced him to borrow the money from my father instead. The treatments worked, for a while at least. But then you got accepted into that wonderful school, and we knew the tuition would be impossible with the loan payments. That's when your father made the decision to sell the shop. Not just for your school, but to repay my family's loan in full. He wanted to tell them the money was coming, but I made him promise to keep it quiet. You see, my father was a proud man who looked down on your dad for being a simple mechanic. I couldn't bear for him to know that his loan had forced us to sell the business. The day your father signed over the shop, he took half the money and paid back my family, even though by then I was sick again and we could have used it for more treatments. Debts have to be paid, he said. What kind of example would I be setting for our son if I didn't honor my obligations? The other half went to your tuition, every penny of it. And my treatments. Your father took on 3 extra jobs to pay for them. He worked days at a factory, nights as a security guard, and weekends doing odd jobs. That's why he was so tired all the time, why he sometimes missed your games and school events. I know you thought he was being irresponsible, running himself into the ground. But he was doing it all for us. He was trying to give you a future while taking care of me, and somehow keep his dignity in the process. Your father isn't perfect, Ethan, but everything he's ever done has been out of love. For you, for me, for our family. Don't let Catherine's bitterness blind you to that truth. Love always, Mom. Tears fell onto the letter as Ethan read the last lines. In the wallet, he found more treasures. His first report card, a photo of him graduating high school, newspaper clippings about his business success, and at the very bottom, a faded receipt for the loan repayment, dated just 3 days after the auto shop was sold. He paid them back, Ethan whispered. All of it. Even when Mum was sick again. Of course he did, Lily said, arriving at the hospital still in her pajamas. Dad never let a debt go unpaid. Not a financial one and not an emotional one. Why do you think he kept trying with you all these years, even when you pushed him away? He felt he owed you a father's love, no? Matter what. Dr. Phillips emerged from the emergency room looking tired but relieved. He's stabilized. The episode wasn't as severe as last time, but he paused. His heart is getting weaker. If he's going to have any real chance at recovery, he needs complete rest. No stress, no emotional upheavals. Can I see him? Ethan asked. The doctor nodded. Briefly, but remember what I said. Keep things calm and peaceful. In the hospital room, George lay connected to monitors, but his eyes were clear and alert. When he saw Ethan, he tried to speak. The wallet, he began. I found Mum's letter, Ethan said, taking his father's hand. I know everything now. About the loan, about the jobs, about all of it. I wanted to tell you so many times. Why didn't you? George's eyes filled with tears. Because you needed to believe in yourself, not feel guilty about my choices. Your mother understood that. Everything we did was so you could become the man you were meant to be, without the weight of our sacrifices holding you back. But I never knew. Ethan's voice broke. All those years I spent angry at you, thinking you'd failed us. You knew what you needed to know back then. You needed to be hungry, to be driven. If you'd known everything, you might have given up your dreams. To help us, we couldn't let that happen. A nurse came in to check George's vital signs, frowning at his elevated heart rate. "Mr. Carter needs to rest now." "Wait," George said, gripping Ethan's hand. "There's something else you need to know. Your mother, the night before she died, she made me promise." The heart monitor started beeping faster. The nurse moved toward the call button. "Dad, please, you need to stay calm. Whatever it is can wait." "No," George insisted. "You need to know she made me. Promise to keep trying with you no matter how long it took. She said our love for you was the best investment we ever made. And seeing you now, the man you've become, she was right." The nurse was insistent now. "That's enough. Mr. Carter needs rest." Ethan leaned down and kissed his father's forehead. "I love you, Dad. Get some sleep. I'll be here when you wake up." As he left the room, Ethan felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally been lifted. The truth hadn't been what he expected. It was better, deeper, more meaningful than he could have imagined. Outside the hospital room, Rebecca waited with 2 cups of coffee. "Are you okay?" Ethan looked at his father's wallet, still clutched in his hand. "All these years, I thought I was successful because I did everything on my own. But the truth is, every step I took was built on their love, their sacrifice. That's what real family does," Rebecca said softly. "They lift you up even if you don't know they're doing it." Through the window of the hospital room, Ethan watched his father sleeping peacefully. The monitors beeped steadily, each sound a reminder of how precious and fragile life could be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new worries about his father's health. But tonight, at least, the truth had set them both free. 6 months had passed since that night in the hospital, when the truth about the past finally came to light. The gardens of Ethan's mansion were in full bloom, transformed by George's careful attention during his recovery. Where there had once been just manicured lawns, there were now vegetable patches where he taught Emma and Jack about growing tomatoes, and flower beds that filled the air with sweet fragrance. "The doctors said to rest," Ethan scolded gently, watching his father prune a rose bush. "Not start a farming operation." George straightened up slowly, his movement still careful but stronger than before. "Working with your hands keeps the heart young," he said with a smile. "Besides, your mother always wanted a garden like this." The mention of his mother no longer brought pain, just warm memories and gratitude. Since finding her letter, Ethan had spent hours talking with his father about the past, filling in the gaps of their shared history with understanding instead of anger. "The board meeting went well today," Ethan said, helping his father to the garden bench. "The new Family First policies are already showing results. Employee satisfaction is up, turnover is down. Following your heart turned out to be good business after all," George chuckled. "I learned from the best." Ethan sat beside him. "Though I wish I'd learned it sooner." Inside the house, they could hear Rebecca directing caterers and decorators. The annual Carter Technologies charity gala was being held at the mansion for the first time, and she'd been planning it for months. "Are you sure you're up for a big party?" Ethan asked his father. "Wouldn't miss it," George replied, "especially not today." Ethan smiled, thinking of the surprise he had planned. The guests would be arriving soon. Board members, employees, business partners, and their families. But this year's gala would be different from the formal corporate events of the past. As evening approached, the garden filled with people. Children ran playing through the paths George had created, while their parents mingled and chatted. Marcus Reynolds arrived with his grandchildren, who immediately joined Emma and Jack in a game of tag. Lily helped George to his seat at the main table, fussing over him until he shooed her away with a laugh. "I'm not made of glass, sweetheart." When everyone was seated, Ethan stood to make his speech. The garden lights twinkled like stars above them, and the sweet scent of roses filled the air. "Welcome, everyone. This isn't just Carter Technologies' annual gala. Today marks the launch of something very special, the George and Helen Carter Foundation." A murmur of interest ran through the crowd. George looked up at his son in surprise. "This foundation," Ethan continued, "will provide support to working parents struggling to balance career dreams with family responsibilities. It will offer educational scholarships, medical assistance, and emergency funding to families in need. Because 30 years ago, a mechanic and his wife sacrificed everything to give their son a chance at a better life. Today, we honor their Love by passing that chance on to others. He turned to his father, whose eyes shone with tears. Dad, you and Mum taught me that true success isn't measured by what we gain, but by what we give. Every grant this foundation makes will tell your story. The story of parents who love their children enough to put their dreams second. George tried to speak but couldn't find the words. Emma slipped her small hand into his, while Jack stood proudly behind his grandfather's chair. The foundation's first project, Ethan announced, is the restoration of a certain auto repair shop on Mason Street. Now George did speak, his voice thick with emotion. But that old place must be falling apart by now. It needs some work, Ethan admitted, but we're turning it into a training center for young mechanics, a place where people can learn the trade you loved so much, Dad. And over the door there's already a new sign, George Carter Technical Academy. Applause broke out among the guests. Rebecca squeezed George's shoulder as he wiped his eyes. I don't deserve all this, he protested quietly. You deserve so much more, Ethan said. But this isn't just about you, Dad. It's about what you taught me, that every parent's sacrifice, every act of love, creates ripples that go on forever. This foundation will help those ripples reach more families, change more lives. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, Ethan and George sat in the garden enjoying the peaceful evening. The moon cast a gentle light over the flowers George had planted with such care. Your mother would be so proud of you, George said softly. She'd be proud of us both, Ethan replied. We finally got it right, didn't we? We did. George touched the old wallet he still carried, now stuffed with new photos of his grandchildren. You know, I used to dream about fixing up that old shop, making it something special. Never imagined it would happen quite like this. Dreams have a way of coming true, Ethan said, just not always the way we expect. From inside the house came the sound of Emma practicing her piano, the simple melody floating out into the night air. George closed his eyes, listening. You know what the best part is? He said after a while. It's not the foundation or the school or even having my health back. It's this, sitting here with my son, at peace. No more walls between us, no more unspoken words. Ethan looked at his father, really looked at him. The years of hard work showed in his weathered face and calloused hands, but his eyes were bright with joy, and his smile was the same one Ethan remembered from childhood, before misunderstanding and pride had driven them apart. I love you, Dad, Ethan said simply. I love you too, son. Always have, always will. Above them, a shooting star streaked across the sky. In the garden George had planted, new life was growing. Inside the house, a family's love had taken root and flourished. And in the hearts of a father and son, peace bloomed like the roses that filled the summer air with their sweet perfume. Some said it was just a simple story of family reconciliation. But for those who knew them, the story of Ethan and George, Carter became a testament to love's power to heal, to forgive and to transform. In the end, it wasn't about success or failure, pride or humility. It was about the choices we make for love and how those choices echo through generations, teaching us all what truly matters in life.